Saffrick, did you conduct an equivocal death evaluation into Ms. Mullis's death?
I did.
And did you review evidence related to the investigation into her death as part of your evaluation?
Absolutely.
Can you tell us in general terms what you reviewed?
So, what is important in literally any type of investigation is the initial police investigation. So that would be any investigation they did, any evidence that was collected, any testing of that evidence. In a death case, it would be the autopsy protocol, photographs and diagrams from the scene, any interviews of witnesses, the assessment of the scene itself. That is all the critical information. Typically, in those types of investigations, what occurs weeks or months later oftentimes isn't really relevant to what I'm doing, because I'm doing a crime scene analysis. So it's everything that's attendant to the initial scene, which is typically frozen by police on their arrival.
And I do want to start talking, I want to start by asking you some questions about the scene that you just referenced. Based on your evaluation that you conducted in this case, did you develop opinions about the scene of Ms. Mullis's death?
Yes.
And are you aware that in this case, prosecutors argued to the jury that the scene of Ms. Mullis's death was staged?
Yes, I'm aware of that.
All right. So when we talk about the concept of the scene in the Mullis investigation, what do you understand to be the scene of where she was injured?
Well, okay, so I would say more broadly, the scene is literally the entire farm area of the Mullis farm. If we're referring just to the injury location, that would be the shed that stands between the house and the hog barns.
Is it your understanding in this case that Ms. Mullis died at the hospital?
Yes.
And why do you consider the scene to be the shed and the Mullis farm in this case?
Well, okay, so I would say I would consider the Mullis farm, or at least certainly the area around the house and the shed and the workshop and the hog barns, as the overall scene area, because there were witnesses and individuals in those locations. I would say that the shed is the location for Miss Mullis's passing, because there's physical evidence in the shed that suggests that. The interviews that were conducted, the information derived from those interviews indicates that. And the police investigation and their theory is that her death took place in the shed.
In your training,
which I think is accurate.
And when you're talking,
her injury took place in the shed.
In your training and experience, what does it mean for a scene to be staged?
So staging a crime scene is an attempt by the offender of, say, the homicide, because that's typically where you see staged crime scenes, is in homicides. It's an attempt by the offender to misdirect the investigation. And the way that they misdirect the investigation is to introduce either spurious or fake evidence, remove evidence, or create contrived activities or behaviors that actually didn't occur. And the idea is that the purpose is that they're trying to create a new scene that has a new motive, because that's what they want law enforcement investigators to look at and draw their own conclusion that this is what is actually occurring as opposed to what actually occurred. And so they stage the scene. The reason that staging is, and recognition of staging at a crime scene is important, because it because strangers don't need to stage a crime scene. They don't have a relationship dynamic with either the victim or the scene or both. So when you see intentional staging, then it suggests that that the offender has some relationship with the victim or the scene or both of those.
So how is it that law enforcement evaluate whether or not a scene is staged?
Well, that's the point. So the offender, he manipulates the scene, either the forensic evidence or the behavioral evidence or the physical evidence. They manipulate the scene to change it so that when law enforcement comes and looks at the scene, that they're trying to overwhelm what law enforcement's logical conclusion about the scene would be, to make them think it's actually something different. So a new type of case that has a different motive. The problem is that when you are staging a crime scene, all of this activity then is happening after the crime. So it's not occurring in the right sequence or the right time order. And so you get inconsistent forensics, you get inconsistent injuries, you may have blood spatter in a location that doesn't fit the crime. So there are a lot of red flags that are evident in staged crime scenes.
Did you see evidence in this case that the scene of Ms. Mullis's injuries was staged in some way?
No.
And can you explain how you reached that determination?
Well, I would say first off, when you stage a crime scene, the point is that you need law enforcement investigators to come to the scene and look at it. You've changed the scene. You've changed the victim. You've changed evidence. You've created something that is supposed to look different. But you need investigators to see it because you need for them to draw their own conclusions about the scene. Incorrect conclusions, but that's the whole point. So here you don't even have a scene. And that's the point. So there's no staging that's going on here because investigators, they only come to the shed at a later time.
So why was there no scene in this case?
I'm sorry?
I said, why is it that there was no scene in this case as you just mentioned?
Right. So there's no scene because, first of all, Amy Mullis is not deceased. And there's an attempt to render aid to her, both in the shed and then subsequently in the truck, and then subsequently at the roadside location where dispatch advises him to stop the truck and meet law enforcement. There's no scene. The victim is not there. Everything is, suggests that Mr. Mullis was attempting to render aid to his wife in getting her to the hospital. So there's no scene to analyze, not for staging anyway.
In your experience, is an aspect of scene staging sometimes that a person that is staging a scene will generate a situation where someone else will find the victim?
Yes, that's very common, and not even in staged scenes, but in other types of homicide cases where it's called, what we refer to it as third-party discovery. So what they don't want is to discover the victim, because then it creates a problem for them because they're not at an arm's length distance. So oftentimes they will have somebody else discover the victim. That could be a neighbor, it could be a coworker, it could be a friend. That puts them at arm's length from both the scene and the victim, and essentially allows them to try to create an alibi.
Well, here you're aware that it was not Mr. Mullis that found Miss Mullis, is that right?
Yes, I'm aware of that.
And
yes.
In your evaluation of this case, did the circumstances of this case fit the third-party discovery dynamic that you just described?
I would say no for two reasons. One, in every third-party discovery, in any case I've ever worked or any case that I'm aware of from my time in the FBI's behavioral unit or in my 18 years subsequent to that, I have never seen a third-party discovery where a parent sends a child to make the discovery. It's typically an adult contacting another adult, not a family member, but, you know, as I said, neighbor, friend, coworker, somebody that's disconnected personally, in a sense, from the victim. So that's not my experience to have sent. You know, I've never seen you send a minor child to find, you know, the parent. Secondly, it doesn't really work here because there's nobody here at the Mullis farm. This farm is isolated. It's out in the country. There are no houses around it. There were no other people. So it doesn't make any sense to send, you know, if you're trying to do third-party discovery, it doesn't make any sense to send your minor child to make the discovery. For one, there's nobody else around, and two, the time frame is literally minutes. So we're not talking about hours or, you know, or days. We're just talking minutes. So it wouldn't serve any purpose in terms of distancing yourself from the scene to send your minor child.
Did you see evidence in this case that Tristan Mullis was interviewed by authorities, you know, soon after the events that brought Ms. Mullis to the hospital?
Yes, he was interviewed within minutes after the event.
Did his availability for interviews influence your conclusion that there's not evidence of third-party staging here?
Yes, partially. It's one of the things that I would say is consistent with it. Because he's a minor, you know, you have to have parental permission to interview a minor, and Todd gave permission immediately for Tristan to accompany law enforcement back to the house to show them and tell them what he saw, what he did, you know, what he found. And so that's inconsistent, really, because if you're the offender, you don't want a third party to be making statements that might, you know, affect your credibility or, you know, whatever you've told law enforcement.
And did you see evidence in this case of Mr. Mullis interrupting or preventing law enforcement from interviewing Tristan without Mr. Mullis there?
Your Honor, I'm going to object to this line of questioning as improper expert opinion testimony because it's a comment on credibility not only of Todd Mullis but also of Tristan Mullis in this case. Credibility is a determination solely for the fact finder, and it is not subject to expert testimony under 570(2), 3, and 4, I believe.
Overruled.
I think I did not get an answer to that question, Your Honor. Is that correct?